studentship. Now, so previous scholarship has not uncommonly argued actually that children are sort of invisible or inaccessible when investigating the past, and it's even been suggested, though it's got to be said, not so much now, that parents didn't really care about their children, and there wasn't this concept of childhood really in the past. And an often quoted passage from Socrates claims that no one cares about birth, about upbringing, or education. And sort of quotes like that, as well as stronger evidence, for example, of infanticide, has at times been taken as evidence of the ancient Greeks not really caring about their children and not really acknowledging that childhood was a distinct life course stage. Now, fortunately, in recent decades, scholarship and the assumptions really that underpin those interpretations are being critiqued, and thereby those interpretations of this lack of childhood and this lack of care for children, that is being refuted. And it's now obvious that ancient Greek parents cared for their children and could care for their children as much as any others. And as well, that not only was childhood a distinct period in the life course in ancient Greece, but it was one that was specifically catered to, not least in the production of examples of a specialised material culture. And one aspect of this that struck me in particular was this really quite prevalent assertion that children are invisible or inaccessible in domestic contexts, so in excavated houses. And given that our understandings of ancient Greek society indicate that children, and certainly boys up to around the age of 7, where we could think of them progressing into education, and girls up to the age of marriage would be spending the majority of their lives within the confines of houses in ancient Greece, I think that makes it particularly problematic that they're not really looked for in those contexts. And it was really a desire to address that and to find a way to look for children in domestic contexts that was the initial driver behind developing the methodology for my PhD. And I designed that methodology such that it capitalizes on the fact that we do have significant evidence of children from ancient Greece. And they were formally buried and characterized in art from at least as early as 900 BC, so the beginning of the geometric period. And in those burials and in a range of artistic representations, they're often associated with a certain material culture, or I should say really certain material cultures. Because I think there's this distinction between the material cultures of children and the material cultures of childhood. And I think it is useful and important to distinguish between the two. So I just want to dwell on that for a moment here. And I mentioned at the beginning being somewhat flippant about that title and asking only what can toys tell us, because I think that really does limit the field of study. And exploring that contrast between a material culture of children and a material culture of childhood, I think really enforces that and stresses the importance of looking beyond toys when we're looking to make the most of the evidence of children. So this material culture of childhood, first of all, is, at least to my mind, the range of things used only by children. And for example, there we're thinking of things like high chairs and potty stools that we'll look at in a short while. In contrast to that, then, I would suggest that this material culture of children is much broader, because it can encompass anything that children interact with. For example, they might repurpose objects, serve as toys, that don't really serve that purpose as a matter of course, and would not really be defined as toys, especially not if we're looking at them with an adult perspective. And therefore, there wouldn't initially be that affiliation with children. And especially at a significant removal of time between when that association and that interaction between the child and the object takes place. And thus, for us investigating ancient Greece, that association wouldn't necessarily be obvious or immediately accessible. But I think that the key point to take away is that element of possibility, and that can really influence how we categorize objects and how far we, an acknowledgement is created there of how far we exclude children in traditional material culture studies. But returning back to my methodology more directly, the essential argument of it is that we have this range of material culture that is clearly associated with children. And that's even if some examples of it are also associated with non-juveniles. That doesn't negate that they are as well associated with children. And those associations are apparent in burials and iconography, and then examples that have been identified of that material culture can be sought in excavated houses. And the distribution of those finds can suggest how children use domestic space, but also how they interacted with other members of their oikos, their household, their family. And from that, how their identities were conceptualized in society according to the nature of their material culture and evidence for its use. And a quick example of that illustrates the methodology quite nicely, I think. So terracotta figurines that are quite clearly characterized as dolls are found in burials, and usually it has to be said with female children. And the example in the center of the slide here, which you can see sits on sort of a throne type chair and is accompanied by assemblage of miniaturized objects, including a pair of boots and a tool that would be used in woolworking, as well as a vase that would be associated with marriage rituals. This was found in the grave of a maiden in Attica, and it's now in the collection of the British Museum. But girls are also associated with similar figurines in iconography. And on the left of that assemblage, you can see a girl standing at a tomb, and she's sort of offering one of these figurines at the tomb on a white ground painted lekithos. And then at the top, we see a younger girl gazing down at a similar figurine on a gravestone that unfortunately laments her early passing. And now if we look to houses excavated on really an extensive scale at the settlement of Olynthus in the Chalkidiki, we see that similar figurines are excavated in some of those houses. And they're often interpreted as ritual figurines, and the possible links with children are ignored, even if they're found in association with objects that would indicate that women, and of course we're thinking of women as children's primary caregivers, spent significant amounts of time in those spaces and carrying out day-to-day activities like woolworking, which would presumably be taking place in tandem with childcare. And so my suggestion from before then is considering that these examples of material culture with that broader perspective, that gives greater consideration to that prospective archaeology of children, it stands up to scrutiny when we're looking at various types of evidence, and multiple evidence types corroborate one another. And this dolls case study, just as an initial one, sort of reiterates that, and I'm going to explore it actually in more detail a little later on. But it indicates that dolls were part of children's material culture, which they played with in the household, probably in the company of women, and we're thinking of women as their primary caregivers. And some of this is corroborated really by the literary evidence and by scenes from the broader repertoire of painted pottery iconography. And as I said, this is just a brief introduction to the methodology in practice, and I'm going to return to it. But I think it's important, first of all, to think about the range of materials that I'm talking about as this material culture of children. And so my PhD, hang on, I think a slide has just been missed out there. Yes. So my PhD investigated both the material culture and the extended life course of children, which I'm talking to you about today. And the focus was on Attica and across the 9th to the 4th centuries BC, because that is where the evidence is concentrated. And I was considering children's material culture, their social identities, and their extended life courses. And I'll discuss each of those elements in due course with you today. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, my methodology was constructed on the fact that there is substantial evidence available when we're looking to investigate children and childhood in ancient Greece. And for Attica in particular, we have geometric black figure, red figure painted pottery, and they can be used to investigate children's lives. And then burials, grave stelae, which are just grave markers or tombstones, and white ground painted pottery, that being usually deposited in burial context and often decorated with scenes commemorating death, can be used to investigate children's deaths, as well as their identities that continue into that post-mortem period. There is also some overlap, it's worth noting, whereby examples of children's treatment in burials, for example, make suggestions about their identities and experiences in life. But ultimately, the purpose with this slide really is just to illustrate that examples of geometric black figure and red figure pottery, as well as burials, stelae, and white ground pottery, when they're catalogued and evaluated to quantify the associations between children and examples of material culture, they can inform upon children's identities in the oikos, in excavated houses, and across the extended life course. And just to give a sense of scale and proportion, these are the data sets that we're working with here. There's 28 geometric pots decorated with iconography, including a child or children, 96 black figure scenes and 775 red figure scenes, 415 grave markers, 830 burials, and 55 white ground pots. And the geometric pottery, as the name suggests, is produced in the geometric period, but in particular between the period 760 and 700 BC. The black figure is archaic and classical, and we're thinking about the period 625 to 400 BC with that. And then with the red figure, late archaic and classical period in mind there, with the period 530 to 375. The white ground pottery is predominantly classical, is almost entirely red figure of the, white ground pottery, that's almost entirely 5th century and thereby classical. And the grave stelae are archaic and classical, but their production sort of bookends the production of those white ground vases. Earlier examples being produced around 530, and then the later examples produced between 450 and 300, with that hiatus in between that seems to cater to the white ground pottery. And burials were catalogued that were dated throughout the period 900 to 323. And in all of these evidence types, material culture was associated with children, with some patterning being apparent. But I think actually it's useful to present the results of this in sort of summary form, because the quantities involved are really quite substantial. And my appendices that were cataloguing this were no less than 350 pages of the thesis. So certainly a summary form of this is ideal today. And so we see that the predominant material culture of children then is high chairs, shells, amulets, feeders, coos jugs, which you can see to the bottom here, as well as yo-yos, hoops, rattles, balls, astragallois, we're thinking of knuckle bones from animals there, terracotta figurines of various types, and then rollers and toy carts. And you can see the two boys on that coos jug are playing with the toy carts there. Now, this table just details which evidence types provide evidence of interactions between children and each type of material culture, with the abbreviations such that RF is red figure, WG white ground, and B burials, etc. And you can note that the relationships between children and material culture are particularly in evidence on red figure pots and in burials, by virtue of those really being the really larger data sets. But as well, there's relationships between children and this material culture on all of the evidence types, except geometric pottery. And that only really associates children with swords on rare occasions. And it seems that they're sort of ideograms of masculinity rather than indicators of material culture for children in the geometric period. And this more colourful chart gives you a sense of the chronological distribution of the associations between children and certain types of material culture. And you can see that some of the key associations, in terms of the associations, in fact, that would leave archaeological traces are, and I'm going to summarize those on the next slide, they're really quite long-lived. For example, feeder cups and figurines of various types were associated with children in all periods. That said, it's in the classical period, which is represented towards the right here, that the material culture is at its richest, and that is where my concentration is today in presenting examples to you on the classical period, and especially classical houses. And I've alluded to the point before, and indeed it's one of the potential flaws of the methodology, which I was concerned about when I first developed it, is that it might actually not be viable to trace some of this material culture of children archaeologically, because it's simply not preserved. But fortunately, that is the case, and it is only some of this material culture that is not preserved. And by that same token, some of it is, and it can be very useful. In particular, terracotta figurines of dolls and animals, high chairs, feeders, and coups are generally items that we can think of as having good potential to be preserved because they're terracotta and therefore really quite robust. Unfortunately, rollers and toy carts, they were typically wooden, it seems, and so we don't really see those preserved. Amulet strings, likewise, were apparently quite perishable and are not preserved, or at least they can't be securely identified in the archaeological record. Astrogalloi, those knuckle bones, they are well preserved, but it's really problematic to associate those with children in contexts beyond their burials, if simply because they often represent animal waste rather than juvenile activity. And rattles, unless they're in rather distinct forms, and there are some that are characterized as different animals, are often associated with ritual activity as opposed to children. Hoops, again, apparently made from perishable materials, and like rattles, yo-yos are often difficult to identify distinctly. So we're seeing quite a few of the toys actually. It's problematic to find archaeologically, so hence that need for a broader perspective. Shells as well, like the astrogalloi, often have too many other functions, and they're too general in other contexts to ultimately be used as secure indicators of children for this methodology. So we are ultimately left with that traceable material culture of children that's predominantly consisting of terracotta figurines in various forms, but including dolls and animals, the remains of high chairs and feeders, as well as those coos jugs. And so moving forward with that grounding then, the remainder of this paper is really divided into two complementary parts. The first here, considering the materiality of children's lives, and primarily in that their use of and access to domestic spaces, and then later the materiality of their afterlives, and that's supplemented by a consideration of how children were lamented and imagined when they died in childhood. And we can think about what that suggests about how juvenile identities were conceptualized. I think it's worth just briefly summarizing what we're thinking about in this part, in the materiality of children's lives. And we've got children in context, so we're thinking predominantly here about red figure and black figure pottery, where we're seeing children characterized as if they were alive. We're seeing the predominant associations being with those terracotta figurines, with miniatures of various kinds, coos jugs, high chairs, feeders, rattles, and yo-yos. And it's important to keep in mind, though, I think, that overlap. For example, that many of these objects are actually found in burials, despite the fact that they're informing us about the lives of children. They are often preserved for us in burials. And also important to keep in mind that fact that only certain proportions of these objects are traceable archaeologically, as we were thinking about in that previous slide. And thinking about that traceability takes us really to the crux of the first part of this paper, and the traceability of children in the house. So, and we can use some of the objects pictured here to think about that. The high chair to the left, the feeding cup, terracotta figurines, and especially those more securely identifiable as dolls, and then that jug of the distinct coos kind. And I'm going to talk now through some case studies which test and I hope really demonstrate the viability of the methodology. At first, looking at evidence for this in Attica, which unfortunately is not too well preserved often and is therefore limited in what it can reveal, but also then transferring the methodology to a consideration of housing at Olympus in the Chalkidiki, where the results are more insightful because more evidence is just generally available. Firstly, then, the Dima house in Attica, and it was excavated in the Attic countryside around 10 to 15 miles outside of Athens by British archaeologists in the 1960s. And the evidence suggests that it was an isolated country courtyard house, and you can see the plan of the structures as they were excavated on the right here. Now, the results of the excavation suggest that the house was inhabited for a single phase of use between around 425 and 400 BC, with some brief reuse of the site around 350, but that doesn't necessarily seem to have been inhabitation as such. And the analyses indicate that the inhabitants of the site were probably relatively wealthy. And I think actually that it's pertinent to make this point here, that in the course of this research, it generally is children from, I hesitate to say elite, but certainly families that are more comfortable. That is the focus here with this research, just because, of course, those are the children that would be at liberty to spend most of their time within the house and actually be really afforded that experience of a recognisable childhood. They would have to be children from families of certain socio-economic circumstances, and it is often those more substantial households, those possibly wealthier households that typically have the excavated assemblages that can facilitate the analyses that are required. But despite the fact that the inhabitants of the Dima house were apparently relatively comfortable in their circumstances, the finds assemblage is really sparse. And the suggestion from that is that the house was probably cleared prior to it being abandoned around 400 BC. Now, thinking about looking for evidence of children in the Dima house, the scarcity of the artifact assemblage is undoubtedly a stumbling block, but I think that is in no way to say that the investigation is fruitless. And a possible indicator of a child or children comes in the form of the fragmentary remains of 10 distinctive type 3 oinokoi. And those are those puce jugs that I've talked to you about a number of times now. And they were excavated within the assemblage of this Dima house. But unfortunately, given the excavations were quite early, carried out in the 1960s, the precise find spots of those puce fragments were not actually recorded. And that limits how far we can use precise distribution analyses to understand children's use of specific spaces identified on this plan, even comparatively. But the presence of the puce at all raises this possibility of juvenile inhabitation of this house. And it's an archaeological mantra that's frequently repeated, that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I think in this case, that is pertinent. And it also raises actually a significant point of interpretation, because the only material left at this site was apparently material that had been discarded as refuse. So given that children's material culture does not feature amongst it unless it was broken and therefore beyond utility, indicates, I think, that children's material culture was thought of as personal possessions, just as adult material culture could be. And no material culture that would be classified in that way was found on site at the Dima house unless it was damaged beyond utility and had been discarded as refuge. Therefore, even with this problematic case study with the Dima house, investigation of it is not fruitful, it just has limitations. And it does advance our understanding of the status of children's material culture in classical Greek contexts. Now, the Vari house, situated near the village of Vari and close to a cave sanctuary of Pan to the southwest of Athens, was excavated by the same British archaeologists in the 1970s. And like the Dima house, the Vari house seems to have been an isolated country house. But there is more evidence of industry at the Vary House, including evidence of beekeeping. And you can see down towards the bottom centre of the slide here some beehives that were excavated on the site in plan. The excavator estimated again that the Dima house, like the Vary house, was only inhabited for one period of use, and in this case between around 431 and 421 BC. And they also suggest again, the excavators, that the inhabitants were relatively affluent, but the finds assemblage was relatively sparse overall, and it's again probable that the Vary house had been cleared before it was abandoned. And again, the precise find spots for objects were not often recorded, and this can make analysing children's use of space difficult. But again, I suggest it doesn't make consideration of this example completely fruitless. And again, it's fragmentary remains of some Gooch jugs that provide the possible evidence of children in the Vary house. And the fragmentary remains of two plain black glazed small Gooch were found in a waste deposit in room 2, which is marked by the red spot on the diagram on the right here. And it's a space situated between a possible kitchen and a possible andron, all of which were accessed from a focal courtyard. Now, the fact that the Gooch were in a waste deposit and they were the only material culture associated with children supports again that suggestion that material culture of children was conceptualized as their personal possessions and only discarded in abandoned houses when it was refuse. And this is again in line with how other items that would be considered personal possessions were treated. And that would be different for how objects that were just considered part of a household assemblage, for example, pots used for domestic chores, would be treated. They would more often be left behind, and not only necessarily when they were broken and no longer useful. We can imagine those general household objects lacking those personal connections that were there when we're thinking about personal possessions for children and for adults, and therefore people's personal material cultures. Now, looking to an alternative type of context that still represents the archaeological remains of a domestic space, the suggestion of children's material culture being children's material culture, in the sense of it being their personal possessions that were used to say definite things about their identities, is strengthened. And this case study is an archaic well in the Athenian Agora, and you can see it in plan on the left here. It's known as Context J24, and it was a well cut into the bedrock of the Agora, with the shaft of the well extending 5.8 meters down into that bedrock. And it was sealed beneath the wall of a later classical structure around the time of the archaic to classical transition in Athens. And it has strong associations with the Persian sacking of the city in 480 and 479. And the well was excavated in its entirety in 1994 and 1995, and it's since been published in detail by Kathleen Lynch in her monograph, The Symposium in Context, Pottery from a Late Archaic House Near the Athenian Agora, and that monograph appeared in 2011. And the excavations and the post-excavation analyses suggest the contents of the well were a domestic deposit of a single household. And what we're seeing is a period of use layer, and you can see that at the bottom here, labelled as level 6 on the plan, and then a single depositional event, and that's creating the other stratigraphical layers that are labelled from 1A to 5. And the analysis suggests that the house was inhabited between around 525 and 479 BC, and that it was damaged or destroyed during the Persian sack of Athens. The deposition associated with that depositional event was probably either directly a result of that sack of the city, or was the result of the clearing up process afterwards, in preparation for rebuilding and remodelling the house that was on the site. Now, this well obviously does not present the opportunity to understand how children used domestic space in a spatial sense, but it does present the opportunity to critique the nature of children's material culture and to understand how proportionally it may have been represented in a more substantial domestic assemblage compared to the assemblages of the Dima and Vary houses. Kathleen Lynch's monograph reported on the assemblage from well J24 in its entirety, including details of 233 inventoried objects and 48 tins of context pottery. And Lynch records 217 of those inventoried objects in her detailed, extensive catalogue. And those objects could be considered in the following terms for the purpose of analyses that are looking to identify evidence of children. First of all, as material culture used by children, which I outlined at the beginning, and also then as objects possibly used by children. We also have objects that weren't used by children, and then objects with unclear functions. And a feeding cup nozzle from level 2 and the context pottery that was taken from level 2 was the most feasible example of children's material culture. As well, a fragmentary strainer from the same level may also have been that as well as a component part of the same vessel, but that is quite difficult to confirm on the basis of the evidence available. And you can see level 2 highlighted by the red spot on the plan. Various eating and drinking vessels were examples of type 2 objects as well. So they were objects possibly used by children, and that idea is strengthened by the fact that they were in miniature form. So ultimately, it's just over 15%, 15.28% of the objects that formed the assemblage taken from this well could have been used by children. That feeder and possibly the strainer, as well as some cups and bowls, which were of miniaturized sizes, a miniaturized hydria, which in its general form is used for storing and transporting water, as well as a cotile, so a small two-handled cup, a miniature jug, terracotta figurines in forms of sort of anthropomorphic figures and animals, an astragallos, and a pierced bone disc. And that was of indistinct function, but it could really feasibly have been a wheel from one of those rollers or toy carts, for example. So that is a significant proportion of the assemblage, and it highlights really just how much evidence could be being overlooked in analyses that do not seek children out. And you can see this represented diagrammatically here, and the orange segment of the pie chart demonstrates the objects that were possibly used by children, including that feeder nozzle, because there is this argument to be made that that feeder might not have been exclusively for the use of children. The use of similar vessel types for invalids, for adults, is attested historically, though that probably often represents the repurposing of children's material culture rather than a negation of the existence of children's material culture in that case. The grey segment demonstrates objects that cannot be said to be used by any particular demographic because their function is too indistinct. But ultimately, it's only the blue segment that represents the agency of adults in likely opposition to the agency of children. And I think that clearly demonstrates how far traditional scholarship that does not seek to make children accessible or visible in analyses of domestic context could be overlooking evidence of children's activities and their agency. And the patterning, again, observed supports this suggestion that children's material culture was probably children's personal possessions that were intimately entwined with creating and demonstrating their identities, because items classifiable as personal possessions were only rarely represented in the well assemblage, and only then really when they were broken and so had been discarded as refuse. Otherwise, the objects that were deposited in a more complete state, including many pieces of symposium pottery, and hence the title of Lynch's monograph, were objects that would be part of the household assemblage and therefore were not associated with one person or group as specific markers of personal identity. Now, I mentioned earlier that unfortunately, despite the fact that a lot of the evidence of the material culture of children is from Attic context, the evidence of housing in Athens and Attica is not necessarily so readily available. And so it really is difficult to fully test this methodology solely concentrating on Attica. That would be ideal for consistency, given the variability across polis of the Greek world. But That said, one site for sort of investigating housing without compare really is, of course, Olympus. And the settlement did have classical links with Athens, not least by being part of the Athenian Empire until around 432. So it's very valuable as a case study for testing out this methodology, and it's to Olympus that we turn now. Firstly, to look at a simpler dwelling and one of the terraced houses on the north hill of the settlement. House AVII4 is a type house for Olympus, with a central courtyard and an adjoining pastas, a portico. And you can see some of the elements labelled on the diagram on the right here, and their sort of interpretations in accordance with the evidence presented in the published excavation reports. This house was occupied after 432 BC and was destroyed, probably including by being burnt in the sacking of Olympus by Philip of Macedon in 348. And the house was excavated in the 1920s, and more than 100 distinct finds were unearthed and recorded across the 11 rooms and spaces that made up the dwelling. And they notionally included, as you can see on the right here, a focal courtyard, a portico adjoining that, a kitchen, an andron, and then an associated anteroom to that andron, as well as a space that was probably used as a shop or something similar. And the artifact distribution analyses indicate that at least one space was possibly used by a child or children. Terracotta figurines that I've already discussed can feasibly be identified as dolls were found in space I, the focal courtyard. And further analysis of this can also make suggestions about how children interacted with other members of their oikos. The space highlighted in blue, the andron, was used to host symposia and was predominantly the domain of men. And some of the primary domains of women, as indicated by artifact distribution analyses conducted by Nicholas Cahill, are highlighted in red. And they are the workroom and then this focal courtyard. And it's interesting that there is this demonstrable intersection between the spaces used by women and by children in that focal courtyard space, because of this sense of women being children's primary caregivers and of childcare being something that was a feature of women's lives alongside woolworking and other domestic tasks. And that is corroborated by the literary sources and by the broader iconographic repertoire, particularly on red figure pottery. And it's worth pointing out at this point as well that this, I think, is a worst case scenario for children's access to domestic spaces in a sense. These analyses don't tell us that children categorically did not access more spaces in these houses, only that the evidence is not available to confirm their access to some of these other spaces. And in many ways, the impression from another and more elaborate house at Olympus is similar. The House of Many Colours, House FII9, was a larger dwelling situated in the villa section to the southeast of the settlement at Olympus. And the House of Many Colours was occupied from the late 5th century, and like the earlier house, was probably razed to the ground during that Macedonian sacking of the settlement in 348. Now, the House of Many Colours was excavated in 1938, and around 300 distinct objects made up the assemblage, including 98 complete vessels. And the finds were distributed across 13 rooms or spaces, some of which can notionally be identified as, again, a kitchen, an andron and its anteroom, and a daily living or working space, as well as a couple of courtyards in this house. And the probable location of the house is indicated by the blue arrow on the diagram on the right here. And so thinking about children in the House of Many Colours, the evidence is more substantial. The analyses suggest children probably used at least 5 spaces, and terracotta figurines were found in spaces B and H. Now, the situation with space H is more problematic because it was a flue for the kitchen. So the deposition was probably resultant of discard activity in that context. But the situation with space B is more useful and informative. And the excavators suggest that space B was an ancillary courtyard to the main daily living and domestic workspace to which it was adjunct. That's space A. And this mirrors the situation in many ways with the courtyard space in House AVII4, though on a more elaborate scale, and that is to be expected, really giving the overall general elaboration of the house of many colours. The placement of children's material culture in space B is also suggestive of children accessing spaces E and A because of the routes of access involved to get into space B. And miniature vessels in space F could also be indicative of children's activity, but it's notable that, again, those signatures do not extend into the men's space, into the and one. And as in House AVII4, children's primary domains were apparently with women on a day-to-day basis within the household. So thinking about these case studies in broader terms of interpretation, we can ask how are children represented in domestic assemblages like that of the House of Many Colours at Olynthus, and we can ask what does that indicate about children's access to household spaces. And we see here with the pie chart that children could be really reasonably well represented in domestic assemblages. And this suggests a significant amount of material culture was produced to cater to the needs of children. Both a child's object, an animal terracotta found in courtyard B, and a range of objects that might have been used by children, including further terracotta figurines and miniature vessels distributed across spaces H and F. And mapping this access onto the plan of the house, with yellow highlighting indicating probable access and orange highlighting in suggesting possible access, the summary is that, and again we're thinking of this as that worst case scenario, children were active in up to 38% of the spaces in the House of Many Colours. And briefly, we can see that that's sort of mid-range in the scale of access in houses at Olynthus. And in other houses excavated in a similar way, children could be accessing as much as 55% of the available spaces. Of course, there's the option of taking a more cautious approach with the evidence, and the results in that case, as you can see in the centre towards the left, are more pessimistic. But as I said, I think it's important to be mindful of the fact that the lack of confirmation of children's activities is not confirmation that children were not active where we're looking for them, only that the evidence does not remain to make them and their activities fully accessible. And in absence of being able to fully understand the use of space in some Greek houses, including because of a common lack of information about the function of domestic spaces, a methodology from architectural theory is useful to work with. And this access analysis, which is also termed space syntax analysis, was developed including by Bill Hillier and Julian Hansen in the 1980s, and they've reviewed its potential as well in the more recent 2014 article. And the method is used to logically compare the accessibility of space by quantifying how many boundaries need to be crossed in order to access a bounded space. And a general rule is that more private activity takes place in more bounded spaces. So, for example, in a modern house, some of the most private and most bounded spaces are typically bedrooms and bathrooms, which outsiders would not typically access to the same degree as more public and less bounded spaces like reception rooms. Now, access analyses track the patterns of access required to enter different spaces, and that data is presented in the form of a justified access analysis map. And you can see the map of access for the House of Many Colours at Olynthus on the right here. To make this process a little bit clearer, I've just rotated the map in the centre here down towards the bottom, so that it's more clear how the diagram maps onto the plan of the house. And the circle with the cross is the outside world, and the other circles are spaces or rooms within the house. Solid black circles and the circle with the distinct black outline are transitional spaces like corridors and courtyards, and they're passed through to access other spaces. And the circles that are not filled in, they are distinct spaces where sort of rooms where distinct activity takes place, and the colours there relate to children's access to the spaces as before. And the lines between the circles indicate that boundaries are being passed over. So in many ways, we can think of that as crossing a threshold or going through a doorway. And what we see from this is that there are 4 levels of bounded space in the house of many colours. And so at the most, 4 boundaries had to be crossed to access space in the dwelling. And what is of most pertinent interest here is that children's activity is generally concentrated in spaces that are bounded to the higher degrees. The most secure evidence of children we have in the house of many colours was in space B. And you can see here that is one of the most bounded spaces, and therefore notionally one of the most private spaces within the house of many colours. And these diagrams illustrate the same analyses for other houses investigated at Olympus. And this additional blue shading indicates that children probably access spaces, despite the fact that none of their material culture was found in those spaces. And that's because they're routes of access which children would have to use to access spaces that they are represented in and that we do find their material culture in. And overall, we see a range of access patterns, but again, there's this patterning that children's activities are on the whole concentrated more in spaces that were more bounded and therefore were more private outside the house. And it's also apparent that children typically spent their time in these defined spaces rather than in transitional spaces, unless that transitional space was a focal courtyard, like in the case of house AVII4. Now, I apologise for people that don't like numbers very much, but these results can be summarised in terms of levels of access, meaning in terms of how many boundaries would have to be crossed in each case to access a space that a child or children were active in. And this illustrates all the more clearly, I think, that children were typically spending their time in relatively private spaces that were secured from the outside world. At least it was in those more bounded and thereby more private spaces that we typically find the materiality of children's lives. And that's interesting for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because it apparently contradicts the evidence that we have of the material culture of children, because it's as we move into the classical period that children are more celebrated and almost more advertised, for example, on red figure pottery. And on those grave stelae, and they're classical, and we're seeing children in them on an unprecedented scale. But it also inverts the pattern of housing, because geometric houses, usually compared to these classical houses, have a maximum of 1 or 2 levels of bounded space. So in that case, we can see children having a much more public childhood, because the spaces are much more, the domestic space, is much more public. It's sort of outside of the houses as well as in spaces that weren't very bounded. And that directly contrasts with this idea in the classical period. And so this idea of children's experiences of childhood actually becoming more cloistered as we move into the classical period, with their activity concentrated in private spaces in houses. But yet it's at that time that we're seeing them more advertised in notionally in a public sphere, with those the painted pottery iconography and the grave stelae demonstrating them to an unprecedented degree. And thus I think the materiality of children's lives and the materiality of children in houses can tell us really quite a significant amount about how we see social change across the geometric, archaic and classical periods, impacting the experiences of children's identities and the significance of children in ancient Greece. And the potential of investigating the materiality of children does not end there. And we can investigate the materiality of children's afterlives to further inform how ancient Greek conceptualizations of childhood were, and how ancient Greeks prized their children and why. And so I think it's briefly worth reviewing the materiality of children's afterlives. So the material culture that we see children associated with in their burials and in iconography on grave stelae and white ground painted pottery in particular. It's broadly consistent with the materiality of their lives, but there are some slight differences in emphasis. Predominantly, we're thinking for the materiality of children's afterlives of toys of various kinds, including terracotta figurines, again, of dolls and animals. And the assemblage on the top left here, which includes animal terracottas and miniatures, is from a Apulian child's grave. We're also thinking of miniatures like those in the assemblage pictured, and there's a real range of miniatures associated with children. Also feeding cups like the one on the bottom left, amulets as the boys are shown wearing on the coos towards the centre, and indeed those coos themselves, and ultimately as well animals, both actual animals and their remains. We find those in burials, but also characterizations of animals in terracottas. And now, with a background of the materiality of children's afterlives, I think it's useful to have a grounding in an approach that can be used to investigate the concept of children's afterlives, or at least this is the approach that I drew upon for my PhD. Now, the extended life course is a theory originally from sociology and builds upon perhaps better known life course approaches, and they themselves developed from life cycle methodologies. But the extended life course was brought into the remit of historical studies in 2005 by Hockey and Draper's article Between the Womb and the Tomb. And it has been used for thinking about identity in ancient contexts since then, though not really on any significant scale in relation to ancient Greece. And fundamentally, the extended life course provides a tool for considering that individuals have identities even when they're not really alive. It acknowledges that social existence does not necessarily begin at birth and end with death, because identities are tied to the physical body, but they're not entirely defined by it. So identities can continue to exist in the absence of an independent physical body. For example, through individuals being remembered or imagined after their deaths or before they're actually born. And evidence suggests that identities both before birth and after death could be acknowledged in ancient Greece. But for brevity here, I'm concentrating on the after death aspect relative to children, and the process of the identity transformation is detailed on the diagram here. So in life, we have children with these identities that are both personal, so those are how the children think of themselves, and perceived, so how others think of the children. And then as a result of death and through mortuary practices, those identities are transformed, and it's important to remember, not necessarily destroyed. And they can be transformed into disembodied versions that can be either prolonged, and that's in which cases the identities remain in many ways constant, with the deceased being remembered generally as they were when they were alive. But the identities can also be projected, in which case imagined identities are created for individuals, and particularly children, which moves them further along the life course than they had actually experienced in an embodied sense. And it is this possibility of creating projected identities for children that I'm going to discuss now, to investigate it for what it can suggest about the significance of children in ancient Greek society. So as I mentioned, there is evidence that the extended life course can be explored relative to ancient Greeks, though scholarship has not really done that to date. And sources including Plato and Aristotle acknowledge and discuss identities of fetuses in the womb before birth. And rituals used to honour and appease the dead suggest ideas about the post-mortem endurance of identities as well. The iconography on this white ground lekithos, which is in the collection of the National Archaeological Museum, is interesting here. And it apparently shows a scene conceptually set in the afterlife, and a child, you can see him characterized to the right, stands in Charon's boat, and that's presumably on the River Styx, ready to be taken away by the ferryman who stands in the center of the scene between the boy and his parents. And quite unusually, we see both a mother and a father here bidding farewell to their child. And the clear inference is that the child has died and is being transported into the afterlife by Charon. And this scene is representative of his leave-taking from his still living parents. And the point of interest to note here is that the boy wears a string of amulets across his chest, and you can just see them detailed here. And this is exceptional, actually, in imagery that illustrates children and in contexts where they're notionally deceased. So scenes on white ground lekythoi and grave stelae. But it's interesting because it poses the possibility that the boy continued to exist in a form that required this continued protection of these apotropic amulets, despite the fact that they'd actually failed to save his life. And fundamentally, though, this scene, I think, confers a sense that the extended life course relative to children is something that can be investigated in ancient Greece. It suggests that there was a conceptualization of some form of extended life course, and more than that, that it could be applicable to children. And to explore that further, we can return to the significance and utility of the materiality of children's lives and afterlives. And certain grave goods were typical of children's burials, and to a significant extent, they are the ones that mirror the materiality of children's lives. But other grave goods appear to go beyond that and play a part in constructing identities for children that did not necessarily exist. At least they didn't exist in an embodied sense. And those grave goods could be used to imagine, to create a projected identity for a child that died in ancient Greece. And these grave goods, which were generally atypical of children's graves, and they're actually predominantly associated with adult identities, can be identified as the ones that are listed here. So we're thinking about things like arrowheads, ear picks, epsilytra, so exelytron in the single, and a bowl used usually by women. Also terracotta models of granaries, which are more typically associated with women and maidens. And then jewelry of various kinds, which notably is not usually of a size that would actually be worn by the child. Also things like calithois again, and leatherties, again associated with women and with marriage, and loom weights associated with women's wool work. Also mirrors and pomegranates as symbols of fertility, spools again used in woolworking, and then strigils used in the palaestra by men and by youths, as well as some tools including hammerheads and knives and things. And as I said, it's atypical for these items to be included in burials, and you can note the totals and the proportions in the table on the left here. So of 87 geometric burials, only 17 sort of contain objects like these and hint at that projected life for children, projected identity, sorry, for children. Of 175 archaic burials, there's only 11 that do the same, and then of 364 classical burials, only 24 that do that. So it's clear that this was not a prevalent phenomenon. But looking at the age distributions and at some case study information, it can suggest what this phenomenon may have arose in response to. And it seems that that was exceptional lost potential. There is distinct patterning to suggest that the juveniles that were most likely to be commemorated in such a way that could be said to project an identity for children was when they died at particular points in their life course, when they were approaching major social transitions in the state of their identity. So children that were approaching choic age, and we can think of that as being around 3 years old, and as well those that were approaching puberty. And it's clear that engaging with the extended life course in the sense of creating projected identities for the deceased was possibly a social strategy for commemorating exceptional lost potential. Children were apparently imbued with exceptional potential when they reached major milestones that marked their progression towards becoming adults. So children were prized in ancient Greece, but they were primarily prized for being adults in preparation, and thereby the next generation and the future of their society. And as before, I think it's useful to demonstrate the argument by presenting an illustrative case study. And the case study of Euphoros poignantly illustrates children's materiality as a materiality of lost potential. Euphoros was apparently a boy aged around 10 to 15 years old when he died in Athens around 430 BC, and he was buried in the city's Eridanos cemetery in a sarcophagus with a range of grave offerings. And as well, his burial was marked by a carved marble grave stelae. And you can see that the stelae, which is held in the Kerameikos Museum in Athens, and I've put an image of that on the right here, You can see that it does not necessarily illustrate Euphros as we would expect to see him. The individual depicted is quite distinctly a well-muscled youth preparing to use a strigil. He's not necessarily a boy that's only preparing for puberty. And thus there is an argument that the stelae that commemorated Euphros apparently projected an identity for him that he had not necessarily experienced in an embodied sense. Instead, it created an imagined form of this identity that presented Euphros as the ancient Greek ideal of the athletic youth, projecting him further along his life course in the event of his death, probably at a point when he was just approaching or just experiencing puberty. And being at that stage in his life, we can imagine that Euphros took exceptional lost potential with him when he died. And that was not least the potential to become the youth that he was characterized as on his grave marker. And Euphros's grave assemblage is also quite interesting for its variety. He was accompanied in his sarcophagus by 6 white ground lekythoi, 2 strigils, some fragmentary styli, an astragallos, a kous, a cantharos, which is a little drinking cup, a needle, and a salt cellar, again, a small container, and as well a monkey terracotta figurine. So we can note some touching examples of the materiality of Euphros's life in the materiality of his afterlife. And we can imagine the kous and the terracotta figurines as mementos of his younger childhood. The astragallos and style we can see as the material culture used in his education and entertainment on a day-to-day basis. And then the strigils we can see as tools that he may have come to be familiar with if he had lived such a time that he came familiar with attendance at the palaestra. But ultimately, I think the materiality of Euphros's identity typifies the argument that I've presented to you today. It demonstrates that children's identities could be complex and their lives and afterlives could have significance for their whole society, not just their own oikos in ancient Greece. And because children's identities have left signatures in the form of children's materiality, we can and we should investigate the evidence of children in order to present truly nuanced interpretations of the societies that they lived in. So to review briefly then, toys, or rather the material cultures of children and childhood, can tell us a significant amount about children's identities and about children's experiences and how they related to their families and society in ancient Greece. By extension, the materiality of children can also tell us about the norms and some of the values of ancient Greek society more widely. And this is especially useful because it can be very difficult to access children in ancient contexts. The materiality of children's lives and afterlives, so the material cultures that children interacted with in antiquity, can provide a rare facilitator of relatively direct access because then material cultures would have been used and perhaps discarded by the children themselves. In terms of evidence, we can see that children were associated with a range of material culture in painted pottery and grave stelae iconography, as well as in their burials, and that the pots, stelae, and burials can be preserved really relatively well to facilitate the compilation of a compendium of children's material culture. And a broad spectrum awareness of that materiality of children is really quite illuminative when applied to contexts that are preserved less well, in which children have been said to be invisible, including the domestic contexts in which they probably spent most of their young lives. So ultimately, the materiality of children's lives and afterlives, many objects that were toys, but also some that were not, can tell us a lot about the significance of children's experiences and identities in ancient Greece, not least that they're neither invisible nor inaccessible to us as investigators of ancient Greek history and society. Thank you, and I really look forward to your questions. Sorry, I realise I've overrun a little bit there as well.
So thank you very much, Emma. That was fantastic. I must apologise. I got so excited by the paper that I forgot to turn the recording on at the beginning. So you lost like the first minute or so until member of the audience kindly drew my attention to the fact that we weren't actually recording at that point. But as I say, it's a wonderfully rich paper. Now, we have a tradition of giving people 5 minutes to kind of regroup, make another cup of tea, pour themselves a glass of something, and you maybe need a break as well from talking, and then we'll reconvene for questions, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to work through. So so if we say sort of it's 13 minutes past, so 18 minutes past thereabouts, if we reconvene then, and we can then we'll do questions then. So but thank you first of all for a wonderful paper. It's really rich and lots of things to think about. So
thank you.
Okay, I think we have a few people back. I'm not entirely sure if if cameras are on or not, but we'll assume that people are back and ready to ask questions. So I'm going to exercise extreme restraint and sort of throw open the floor. Does anyone out there have questions? You can either raise your hand or just electronically, or just chip in. Simon, you can see a hand.
Well, I thought that since somebody wasn't asking a question, I'd just kick off with something, even if it's not the best question, just to get you going. There's been quite a lot of work now that you probably know about, and maybe you alluded to it and I didn't pick it up, about looking at villas and properties in the Roman world particularly, and thinking about how people move about them in relation very much to slaves, who are, of course, are another group that are often underrepresented in all types of evidence and are difficult to identify in the evidence, even if they are there. And issues about lines of sight and where people go and controlling movement. And I wondered whether any of that, it may be that the properties concerned aren't big enough for it to be relevant, but the idea of, is there any sense of controlling where children could go, either to exclude them or to make them safe, things like that, just as you might, again, control where slaves can go. And we know from literary texts that there often were physical things to try and stop slaves mixing and things like that. I wondered if there was any comment you would like to make about those approaches to physical space.
Yes, thank you, Simon, for that really interesting question. And definitely slaves, and I think slave children is something that is really interesting, if needs a lot more work doing on it. But in terms of controlling the sort of the movement around the house, and it especially strikes me what you say about lines of sight. And I think that is one of the key points with a lot of this activity taking place and being concentrated in those focal courtyards. And the idea that from that space, actually, a huge proportion of the house is within sight and is visible. So this idea that children could actually have a relatively extensive range of access to the house, but in that could still remain supervised because they could be seen sort of from that courtyard space. So they often are spending time in those courtyard spaces, those focal courtyard spaces. But even if they're not, by virtue of their caregivers being in those spaces, they can still remain visible, and there's still that potential of sort of very much watching what they're doing and their activities being monitored. So I think that's really interesting, and certainly there's a lot more scope there for doing that, I think, for thinking about that.
Thank you very much.
I can see Federico's hand is up.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks very much, Emma. It was so clear, as well as so rich and thorough. And it really gave me the sense that, yes, I mean, in some respects, this is really groundbreaking work. Also the effort that you made at quantifying these things. We all know about the limitations of quantification in this context, but an attempt must be made, Yes, I found that extremely thought-provoking. I was wondering whether there are any bodies of work, of modern work, on children in other historical settings beyond antiquity that in any way have informed your thinking, shaped your questions, or sort of oriented your concerns. I'm just curious. I'm not necessarily assuming that that should have been or be the case, but well, I was wondering. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Federico. It's good to hear that there's it's really innovative material there. And yes, certainly there is influence from wider scholarship. From the Roman world, as Simon mentioned, there's often more being done in domestic context from the Roman world, but certainly more modern contexts as well. Certainly, one of the key things that helped the methodology to fit together was some work by an archaeologist, Jane Eva Baxter, in sort of, I think it was the 19th century America. So really a much more historical context as opposed to that ancient context. And that was looking at material culture of children in houses. And there's this clear sense, I think she used around about 5 case studies, but obviously that's supported by a lot more evidence, not least written sources. And there's clear patterning of how children's material culture is distributed in a house as being really distinct from material culture of adults. So certainly that was something that when I came across it, I thought, oh, there's definitely mileage in this. And obviously it's really useful to have those contexts where there's a lot more evidence available to get an idea of methodologies that can be tested out on the ancient evidence, where it's not necessarily so there's not necessarily so much as there is in the more modern context, but certainly there is material there if only we're looking for it, and we're looking for it in the right way. But certainly that work by Baxter on those more modern contexts was really, really useful.
I allow myself to ask a question. I can't see another. Oh, I can see a hand. Sorry, Vicky got there first.
Hello, thank you very much for your paper, and apologies. I'm currently on maternity leave, so I have a little baby strapped on me. I really enjoyed your paper, a very, very interesting material, and I was really fascinated by your space syntax analysis. And I wanted to ask regarding you whether you have taken into consideration gender as well. Sorry, I must say that I've missed the first part of your paper, so you might have mentioned it, but I was wondering whether you have taken in consideration gender, and in a way, are there spaces that are accessible to boys but are not accessible to girls? And is the materiality that is attached to those spaces gendered in any way? Are there any evidence of that?
Oh, thank you for that question. I really like it. And I can just only be in awe of your multitasking of concentrating on a paper and settling a baby. I can't even imagine. But in terms of gender, a lot of work has been done before mine, and indeed that was some of the impetus for my work about gender in terms of adults, so female and male use of spaces. But I have to say that no, I did not critique the evidence more for gender on the grounds of children. So whether we're seeing boys or as opposed to girls in certain spaces, but it does strike me that would be really fascinating for further research. I think there's certainly mileage in it in terms of with the dolls, the figurines that can be classified as dolls. There's really strong associations there with female children, and they're not associated with male children, apparently. Certainly not in the iconography. With the burials, there is it would be really nice to have more evidence of gender in the burials, and it's really the minority, unfortunately. But certainly in the iconography, there is some patterning. I think that could be that could be followed up and investigated more. The only thing that strikes me is that a number of the terracottas, and I think the terracottas that have even stronger associations with the children than the anthropomorphic figurines, so the animals, there isn't really a gender distinction with them as such, I don't think, or at least that isn't accessible to us. So that could be problematic in terms of those, but I think certainly in terms of other objects, not least including those anthropomorphic ones that are dolls, it would be fascinating to sort of go down that rabbit warren of seeing if you see boys and girls in certain spaces, and indeed who they're associated with in terms of adults as well. Yeah, so thank you. That question's got my brain fizzing now.
No, well, thank you. Fascinating material and an excellent analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Susanna has been waiting patiently. So
thank you. Thanks, Emma. That was really interesting in all kinds of ways, and both the extended life course as well as the sort of the life stuff. I just want, it might not be an altogether fair question, but I just wondered whether there's further avenues of exploration for this in relation to literary representations of children or parents and children, and some of the evocations of material culture in that. I was just quickly looking back through what you said about children's identity and sort of grave clothes. A play that Sally knows I look at a lot, which is Euripides' Ion, where what you've got is something which is both life and death, and what the mother Crusoe leaves in the cradle in which she exposed her child, which includes, interestingly, something from her own childhood, which is this would be the kind of thing that wouldn't survive, her own weaving that she did as a girl, that she leaves for her own sort of child as some kind of mark of identity in the future. So I just wondered if there's any way of exploring the kinds of conclusions that you're coming to from or the possible directions in which the material, physical surviving culture leads, and the small clues, but the clues which are sort of there in some of the literary representations.
Thank you, Susanna. Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, this was one of the things that when I started my PhD, I had this, grander vision of using more evidence than I actually did in the course of the PhD, simply for the restrictions of space, really. So I did look at literary sources somewhat. I have to say that the iconography and the burials and the archaeology did take over, but I did look at the literature somewhat, and it's really interesting because certainly in some parts of that you do see some of this material culture coming across and being described, and it's really heartening actually that the sort of corroboration that comes across from that at some points. For example, in some of it you have described these little figurines and sort of distinct use of those by children as toys, which I think really helps to critique this idea of these figurines by default almost being ritual figurines, which undoubtedly they could be, but I think it's that idea of a broader perspective again, that there's conclusions associated with children that we're not just sort of plucking out of the air, and that is all the more emphasized when you're seeing discussions in the literature of children's interaction with this material culture. But certainly that is something that I regret not being able to look at more in my PhD. It's got to be said, I had a word extension for the PhD in any case, so trying to cut out certain parts of what to look at and what not was certainly an issue that I was trying to overcome at all points. But something, again, I think that there is certainly more research in there in bringing in the literature to a greater extent.
Great, thank you very much. And so that's really, it's kind of nice because one of my sort of subsidiary questions was that about how what was the evidence directing us to these figurines as they so often have been interpreted as ritual rather than childhood, and I've always thought that was a bit boring. Sorry, but it's interesting that if you have got the evidence in literature, that at least they've got that potential dual function, which makes good sense. So, thank you.
Tina, I think, has a question.
Yes. Hi, Emma. Thank you so much for your interesting paper. A small idea about this lekithos with a guy, with a little boy with a necklace. I was reading somewhere that these amulets might be to protect you in your journey until your soul reach this resting place. So that could be like an idea for the little boy wearing this amulet. And a question out of interest is, do you know how did they make these toys? It was like maybe the parents made them for them, or the slaves. There was kind of like a market for these toys. And a further question would be, would it be possible that they got these toys as gifts? I know there were some festivals that they were giving away gifts to kids, the same way that there were festivals and the kids had to give back their toys, becoming adults. So I'm a little bit, I'm interested in this market, like for the toys, if there was one. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Tina. I think really fascinating questions there again. With the lekithos, yes, that is an idea that the amulets are sort of for continued protection on that journey into the afterlife. But it's got to be said that it's very unusual for the children on the lekithoi to be wearing those amulets. I think, from memory, I think it might have been about 3. There were about 3 examples of children wearing the amulets, and there really isn't the evidence in the graves as such that association necessarily continued into sort of the post-mortem period as a matter of course. But I think regardless, that fact that we've got that depiction of the amulets on these children that are notionally in their afterlife is this idea that they continue, their identities continue, such that they would need that protection, and that really is some of the basis of this children having the extended life course. In terms of your other questions about the production, I've got to say that the production is not something that my research has concentrated on as such, but there is evidence, and particularly I think Susan Langdon has looked at the evidence, so we're thinking there about the geometric period, particularly to do with miniatures and material culture in that form, that some of them could be made by children, whether by the children themselves for them, or whether we're thinking about child apprentices and production in that way. Certainly it strikes me that then some of it has got to have been specifically produced, and there been a market of production by adults, by craftspeople, because some of the material culture is just so so skillfully crafted that I think it's difficult to argue that it wouldn't be specifically produced. And certainly some specific production, linking to your third question about the gifts, because those Gooch jugs that I was talking about, they a predominant part of their function as such is potentially as gifts, and they're associated with, I mentioned choic age being around about 3 years old, and children would, we think, participate in the Anthesteria festival at that age, whereby they would be taking their first drink of wine from one of these Gooch jugs to sort of mark a stage of progression of their acceptance into society. So certainly we're seeing the specific production of those Gooch jugs and a huge quantity of that red figure data set, which I said was around about 775 vessels. So more than 600 of those were those red figure Gooch. So probably specifically made for children, and certainly in smaller sizes. I think it's below about 15 centimeters. There are larger examples, but they're not associated with children. They have really distinct iconographic scenes. But the smaller examples, certainly it seems of a market of producing those for children and to be associated with that rite of passage. And that is not to say that they're not associated with children from outside of that age bracket. We do see infants associated with them, and as well as all the children we saw, for example, Euphorus still being associated with the Cous. And I think that could be associated with these being sort of, a gift that are really kept as a memento of certain parts of life, or certain developments in life, certainly. But I'm sorry that I'm not sure how much that answers your question specifically about the production element, but I think there's certainly more investigation to be done there, and as I said, following on from Susan Langton, because that would certainly strengthen, I think, this methodology. If we were finding material culture that had distinct evidence of being also produced by the children, then that's all the more distinct evidence of their activities and their agency in the archaeological record.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay. Federico, you waved your hand then. Was that a question, or were you? Was that a raised hand?
No, it wasn't. I think it was
okay. Sorry,
unfocused gesturing.
Okay,
I'm gesticulating. I'm sorry.
I'm going to allow myself a question now. Then finally, so Emma, there's two things I was thinking about. So the first one was, that you sort of pointed out implicitly the kind of shortcomings of British excavations in the 60s and 70s when compared to Robinson's techniques considerably earlier, which allow us to have some sense of the spatial distribution of artifacts within the houses on the North Hill and the villas. I was wondering, is there some way that the way we're encountering the data is this mapping of the ground floor of the residences, and there is a potential problem there, and that we know that they have upper floors, and a lot of the time, when we now excavate houses, like so the current excavations or the recent excavations on the North Hill, it's we can be sure that we can, reasonably sure that we can distinguish between, if some tile and upper level materials are coming down, that this material is separate, that we might be seeing stuff from an upper floor. But given the way in which things are recorded at Robinson's time, there's a worry surely that some of this material might have got mixed up. And I was wondering, first of all, is there some way of, does it matter, I guess, that we don't have the upper floors, and that so we're maybe only getting a snapshot of a certain time of the day, potentially when children were in one particular space when they could have been elsewhere. So that's one question about kind of the lost upper levels of these houses, and whether that matters in terms of tracking children's movements around a house. And so say from practical experience, the idea of you have to, once a child gets mobile, it does take quite a lot to stop them kind of tearing around, and that leads on to another question, which was actually originally was in my head when Simon was asking his starter question, and that's the presence of slaves. And I take it we're assuming that slave children are present in the same context, in the same domestic, they're part of the oikos. They're even in these kind of quite, I guess in a sort of rather elaborate villa type setting, like the House of Many Colours, then there's scope for keeping them separate, maybe, from the children of the household proper. I guess I was very sort of appreciated your sensitivity around the nature of the term elite. Obviously, in some ways, we have to be cautious about using that, but in some real sense, these are elite members of an elite because they're citizens, because they're actually, they're not implicitly not slaves. And so that the other part of my question, I guess, was when you look across all this material, do you get any sense of sort of social differentiation? So from a practical point of view, you want to raise a child if they're a slave, because otherwise you don't have a slave that's grown up and useful. So they have to be fed. So you'd expect feeding up, vessels and things. But when it comes to toys, etc., are they in some way maybe status markers as well, and differentiating potentially between privileged children in a household setting and children who wouldn't have access to those toys? And I was wondering, are there any, can you see any kind of this is an odd question, maybe impossible, but like lesser grade toys or objects that or do you think that might have played a role in actually constructing the identity of the child from a very early age as different and implicitly better than another child with whom they might have actually shared the same space? So it's messy, sorry, I'll be quiet.
Oh, thank you for the questions. So first of all, thinking about the upper floors, that's certainly something that can be a stumbling block, I think. And actually, I think there's evidence that the House of Many Colours that I presented to you did have an upper floor as well. But the general idea, and this comes from Lisa Nevitt, is that it's not overly distortive. If when we're comparing houses that seemed apparently to have a single story, and some houses that there is that evidence of there being an upper story, that the artifact assemblages are comparable, so that there's obviously going to be some elements of distortion there, but that it's not prohibitive to this sort of methodology. And I think there's some argument to support that there from Bradley Alt's work at Helias. I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, but and the fact that upper floors might be used for sort of light storage and things like that, that could also sort of help with that in a sense. But it's certainly something I think to be aware of, even if it's something that we can't completely work around, because the evidence is the evidence that we have, and it's working within the limitations of that. I think it is something to be aware of, but generally there does seem to be that patterning, that it's not too distortive. So I think it is workable, but it is really important bearing in mind, and I think it relates to that point that I was saying about this very much being sort of a worst case scenario, because as you mentioned, if you've got children and possibly women spending significant amount of time in that upper story, then obviously that might not really be very well represented. So it's something that certainly to be aware of, the fact that the evidence that we have and the evidence that we're looking at here is as I mentioned, that worst case situation in a sense, and that it doesn't we shouldn't interpret it as that the children were not accessing other parts of the house as well. In terms of the social differentiation, I think it's really interesting, and it's worth noting there's on those grave stelae we do see characterizations of slaves sometimes with the children. There's some interesting examples where it's a stelae that commemorates a child, and they're alone, so it is clear that stele is entirely for that child. But then they're accompanied by a little miniature slave, and we get the sense that a slave child, but that's not necessarily the case, because with iconography we're seeing sort of that diminished stature being used to indicate that inferiority of status, not just necessarily age. But I think it does really bring home that fact that in these oikoi, children are spending time with various individuals, with their families, and of course in those contexts, and when we're looking at more wealthier more comfortable households, then there's obviously that greater likelihood of slaves being part of that oikos, and naturally slave children. I'm not really sure how the extent that would be traceable in the archaeological record. And I think your point about sort of that being a way in which the privilege is apparent is probably true. And I think sort of in a sense it's that privilege to have a childhood and to be experiencing a childhood is apparent there in having that material culture that specifically caters to children, and that goes beyond the practical necessities of catering to children, because obviously some of the material culture is sort of in a sense more essential than others, and certainly those toys are not necessarily essential. They are something that you could imagine being associated with more privileged children. And I think as well that sense of a social stratification comes across perhaps most in the burials, where you have some burials that are really richly furnished, and I think one burial had sort of 41 grave offerings, but then you'll have numerous burials that are completely unfurnished. It is just the burial of the child, and there are no offerings, or at least there are no offerings that are traceable now. But then of course as well, that's not to forget about children that weren't necessarily buried formally. So again, I hesitate to again say, oh, there's more research to be done in this, but I think more research is there to be done on the experiences of children that weren't necessarily as privileged as some of the children that are represented in this evidence.
Thank you. That's great. Any other questions? Can I ask another one, just in a very self-indulgent way? So I really totally won over by the argument about needing to take children into account, and this idea that we've been automatically, or archaeologists have been automatically discounting material that might have been used by children or adapted by children, as well as things that were specifically designed by children. I was wondering, it'd be interesting to hear a bit more about what you think about agency, the agency of children specifically, because I was struck looking at that fantastic doll that we started out with. There was the stuff. It's clearly, I guess, if we think of it as a toy, that it's designed to entertain a child, and but it was quite noticeable the way in which it seemed to map out a certain set of activities. Obviously, it's programmatic in terms of what it thinks a woman should be doing. A woman of an adult. You've got the knee guards so that they can card the wall. The various other, presumably maybe there were clothes that originally that went with it. But I was wondering how much of that is, in the sense, if we're thinking about the actual agency of a child themselves, how much of that is actually genuine examples of agency, or is it are we looking at kind of projections, the kind of projections that you picked out in terms of the stuff, particularly commemorations of the deceased? That is there a way in which the toys themselves that are maybe being used in a domestic context or being given to these children are actually stuff helping construct ideas about what they should be doing, and so actually maybe not as good suitable evidence of agency, in the sense of allowing the child some degree of determination, self-determination. It's obviously a completely balmy contrast comparison, but the kind of Montessori type philosophy now, where let a child do what they like and occupy themselves the way they like. You're presenting them with very specific things that they may be learning, behaviors that are being encoded quite early on, and a tangent to that, like not really related, but just so I don't hog the floor too much. The flip side of that, I was wondering if you'd seen evidence for other types of knowledge being passed on to children, and this may be wishful thinking on my part, but I've looked at some of the the figurines and some of the things which I thought might be used by a child. And you have like pointy hatted individuals who could be kind of Scythians. Generally, they're doing things like riding a goose or other kind of slightly improbable activities. Dolphins as well pop up. And I was wondering, if do you what sort of, aside from animals, there's lots of kind of anthropomorphic sort of figurines, etc. The degree of variety that there is in terms of knowledge or activities, etc., that are actually being modeled, I guess, quite literally in the form of little dolls or figurines, etc. So that's kind of two questions. Sorry.
Thank you. Yes, I think there is definitely that idea of sort of children being, in a sense, isn't it? It's children being introduced to the sort of social norms and the values that already exist in society by their introduction to this material culture. And as you said, with I apologize if my internet is playing up a little bit. That sort of that introduction to the norms with those dolls that you mentioned, and you mentioned clothes, and actually, yes, some of them are painted in such a way that it's apparent that they are designed to look as if they're wearing clothing. And I think as well, you can sort of imagine sort of more perishable clothing, and certainly we get the sense of them being used to introduce to children. This is the ideal of what a woman is in the society that you live in, and certainly that is apparent as well with painted pottery that we see as this ideal. And it's often tempting to think of it as sort of photographs and snapshots, and I think all the more so with the children, because they're sometimes doing such engaging activities in the iconography. The children also, you mentioned the goose, and I can think of a goose where a goose is sort of being employed to pull a toy cart, and then the child is riding in the toy cart. So it's all the more tempting when we're seeing things like that to see them as snapshots. But at most points, it's important to remember that actually, these are idealized images that are sort of communicating norms and values. So both in the iconography and in the material culture. And sorry, I'm losing. Can you remind me of the second part of your question, Joe? I've lost the thread of it a little.
I can't remember either. It can't have been that important. I think I'm just sleep deprived. Yeah, other types of knowledge. So like other than kind of animals and because based, if it is kind of pointy-headed Scythians that are being kind of represented in these little figurines, so there are other kind of types of activities or knowledge that are being sort of constructed literally through play, through toys.
Yeah, I think so. Certainly there are other figurines of sort of different othered individuals. I can think of the sort of figurines of dwarfs and of African individuals that would I think be used to sort of communicate certain things to children. And as well, again with the iconography, there's some iconography of sort of children dressed up in strange masks, as if they're sort of and that's on these coos where they're sort of apparently taking part in sort of essentially like a sort of theatre, but they're often with very grotesque sort of masks and things. And I think that's quite striking of how they're engaging with those sort of concepts. And in terms of communicating other knowledge, I'm not quite sure. I mean, there is certainly those miniatures, and as you said, with that figurine from the British Museum, there's that idea of the knowledge of woolworking is going to be one of your primary occupations. You're a woman, and this is one of the things you need to concentrate on. So even your doll is going to have a miniature epinetron for the carding of the wool. So it's very much encoding them social values from really very, very, very early in the life course. I think, if you're thinking of these coos jugs and things like that being that communicate some of those similar things, being introduced to children from when they're 2 or 3 years old. It's a very early point in that life course that this knowledge is sort of being imparted to them, and as you said, that definitely has an impact on their agency. And I think really I'm using agency in a looser term in the context of thinking about children, because obviously they're in a sense certainly at I hesitate to say at the mercy of the adults around them, but certainly under the jurisdiction of the adults around them. But I think just thinking about material culture broadly, I'm thinking about this agency of children, just in terms of not necessarily just doing what is prescribed to them in a simplest term of, if they're taking material culture that is not necessarily a toy, or is not necessarily that material culture of childhood, and repurposing that as material culture of children, then I think there's some element of agency there, because they're taking that material culture that's not necessarily even theirs, and making it theirs in a sense, even if for just that short period of time where there is that interaction between the child and that material culture.
Wonderful, thank you. We've been going quite a long time for questions. Did anyone else have a question? Okay. There was a noise. Was that someone asking a question? No. Okay. I think Emma, it's been going for good 40 minutes, I think, since we started questions, which I think is a testimony to the really rich, it's tantalizing and very poignant, emotive topic as well. It's fascinating, and we're very grateful to you for this wonderfully rich assemblage that you've kind of served up in terms of these various objects, and I'm sure it's given us a lot to think about. So thank you very much for that. We've got next week Owen Maloney from Winchester has the interestingly titled paper "Shenanigans on Stage and Off Demetrius Poliorkestes in Athens." So a heads up about that. So it only remains to say an extremely warm thank you, Emma, and really it's a terrific paper, and I'm sure that once we get our act together with the editing, this is going to attract quite a lot of attention on YouTube as well, because I say I've been having a fair number of questions from people about how to access this after the event, because they couldn't make it tonight and they sent apologies, etc. So I'll try and get an edited version up as soon as possible, and then send an email around, so that if you know of anyone who wants to be here who couldn't, then they can access that too. So bravo, well done, and thank you again. It's absolutely fantastic. So, okay, cheerio, everyone.
Thank you, and thank you for all the questions. It's got my brain fizzing now about where to go next.